I said I can work. Sophie's tiny fists pounded the worn pink lunchbox, her voice shaking but strong. Across the cafeteria, billionaire Richard Cole stopped cold. Nobody had ever talked to him that way, especially not a kid. She opened the box with trembling hands, showing nothing but a wrinkled note. I'm sorry, there's no food today. I'll try again tomorrow. Love, Mom. The man who had created empires felt his chest tighten. Understanding the hunger before him was his fault. What would you feel standing in his shoes? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Richard Cole had spent most of his grown life behind tinted windows and fancy boardroom tables. At 42, the billionaire investor was famous for his quick thinking, his endless energy, and a love for the kind of luxury that few people would ever even see. Yet for all the money that surrounded him, the estates in Tuscany, the glass office in Milan, the private jet waiting on a runway, he carried with him a deep emptiness he could never quite name. Deals were won, numbers climbed, but each win faded as quickly as the ink dried. It was on a clear Thursday afternoon in Milan, when his car slowed near a simple elementary school, tucked between old stone buildings. Richard hadn't planned to stop. He rarely wandered from his schedule, but the sight of children laughing in the courtyard pulled him in with unexpected strength. He parked a block away, loosened his tie, and walked through the gates, carrying nothing but an envelope meant for the school's donation fund. The inside smelled faintly of chalk and warm bread from the cafeteria. Teachers waved to students hurrying down the halls, and Richard felt suddenly overdressed in his custom suit. Still, he pressed on, telling himself this visit was nothing more than a sign of goodwill. He met briefly with the school secretary, left the envelope on her desk, and politely refused any recognition. On his way out, he paused by the cafeteria, drawn by the noise of children at recess. Rows of long wooden tables filled the room. Some children unpacked colorful lunchboxes, others balanced trays from the school's meal line. It was noisy, messy, alive. But in the far corner, he noticed one child sitting alone, a little girl, no older than 7, with dark braids falling across her shoulders. She had placed in front of her a worn pink lunchbox that clearly held no weight. Instead of eating, she was carefully pretending, arranging invisible plates, pouring imaginary drinks, speaking softly as though running a fine restaurant. Richard stopped. The scene was at once sweet and heartbreaking. He drew closer, his shiny shoes clicking softly against the tile. The girl looked up, surprised at first, then smiled with a kind of brightness that caught him. "Welcome, sir," she said seriously, her small hands folded. "Would you like a table?" He sat down awkwardly at the low bench across from her knees, bent almost to his chest. "If you have one available," he answered, playing along. Her eyes lit up. "Of course, today's special is pasta with magic sauce, and the dessert is a surprise." She opened the lunchbox with a big gesture. For a moment, he expected to see nothing. Instead, tucked neatly at the bottom was a folded scrap of paper. Richard's eyes caught the writing before she quickly closed the box again. In careful handwriting, the note read, "I'm sorry there's no food today. I'll try again tomorrow. Love, Mom." The words hit him with the weight of a hammer. He had read financial statements that cut companies in half, seen contracts that moved millions, but nothing in his life had ever cut him like that single line. The child, sensing his glance, closed the box quickly and went back to pretending, stirring the air with an invisible spoon. Richard forced a smile, lifting an imaginary fork. "This pasta is delicious," he said, his voice thick in his throat. The girl's smile grew even wider. "It's my secret recipe. Only special customers get to try it." He nodded, chewing on emptiness. But inside his chest, something shifted. He had spent years chasing meaning in profit margins and quarterly wins. Yet here, across from a child with nothing but a beat-up lunchbox and an imagination strong enough to hide her hunger, he felt a sense of truth he had been missing. The room around them blurred. He no longer heard the clatter of trays or the chatter of other children. He only saw her small hands miming the service of food. She didn't have her innocence protecting her from the harshness of reality. And in that moment, the billionaire, who thought he had everything, felt his eyes burn hot. He blinked rapidly, swallowing against a wave of emotion he hadn't expected and certainly hadn't prepared for. "Do you come here every day?" he asked softly. "Yes," she answered proudly. Except when it rains too much. Then my restaurant closes. She leaned in closer. But tomorrow will be open again. Will you come back? Richard hesitated. He had never promised anything to anyone outside of contracts and boardrooms, but something about her hopeful eyes left him no choice. Yes, he said quietly, I'll come back. The bell rang, signaling the end of recess. She closed the empty lunchbox with practiced care and carried it off as if it were full. Richard sat alone for a long moment, staring at the spot she had just left, haunted by the image of that folded note. For the first time in years, the man who measured his life in billions walked back to his car feeling completely poor, and he knew with a certainty that bothered him that the promise he had made to that little girl was one he planned to keep. The next day, Richard Cole walked through the Hoolgates carrying a brand-new lunchbox wrapped carefully in a paper bag. He had chosen it himself that morning from a small shop near the Duomo in Milan, a cheerful design covered in bright sunflowers. Inside, he had packed pasta, fresh fruit, and a small chocolate bar. He had told his driver not to wait. This was not a quick stop anymore. It was something he planned to do with his own hands. When he entered the cafeteria, his eyes searched for Sophie Martinez almost immediately. She sat at the same table in the corner, the worn pink box placed in front of her as if she were about to open her restaurant once more. She saw him, her expression shifting from surprise to joy, and she waved him over as though he were her most important customer. I saved you a table, she announced. Richard smiled and set the bag down on the table. He opened it slowly, pulling out the sunflower lunchbox and placing it before her. I thought maybe your restaurant deserved an upgrade, he said. Her eyes widened as she touched the box with care. She opened it carefully, and when she saw the real food inside, her mouth fell open. This is for me, for you. Richard nodded, but only if you promise to share with your customers. She laughed, the sound so pure that it seemed to light up the dim room. Without pause, she began dividing the fruit into small pieces, calling to a few classmates nearby. We're serving a special today, she said, her voice proud. Children gathered, giggling, curious, and Sophie handed them slices of apple and little portions of pasta. She gave away more than half before finally taking a bite herself. Richard sat quietly watching as the children around her cheered her on, their laughter filling the space. Sophie's restaurant had become real, not because of the food, but because of the joy she carried with her. He realized that what he had brought wasn't just lunch, it was dignity, the ability to belong without hiding. When the other children returned to their tables, Sophie leaned forward, her voice lowering. My mom says not to take things from strangers, she admitted. But you don't feel like a stranger. Richard's throat tightened. He kept his voice gentle. Your mom sounds like someone very wise. She is, Sophie said quickly. She used to work at a big factory in Florence. She made clothes. She worked a lot, but then they said they didn't need her anymore. She cries sometimes, but she tells me it's going to be okay. Sophie looked down at the sunflower box, her small fingers tracing its edges. That's why I had to pretend yesterday. I didn't want anyone to know. Richard froze. Florence. He knew that factory. It was one of his own places, a textile company he had bought years ago. His mind raced as he remembered the quarterly reports, the restructuring orders, the layoffs. The name Martinez had never crossed his desk, but the decision that had destroyed her life had passed through his hands. He felt the air leave his chest. For a moment, he wanted to excuse himself, to push the thought away as chance, but Sophie's eyes were fixed on him with the kind of trust that allowed no room for denial. He nodded slowly. Your mom must be very strong, he said softly. Sophie grinned. She is. She tells me to keep drawing and to keep smiling. She says, tomorrow will always come. From her backpack, she pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. It was a drawing done in bright colors, 3 people sitting at a table together eating. A woman with long dark hair, a little girl with braids, and a tall man in a suit. This is me and Mama, she explained, pointing to the first 2 figures. Then she tapped the man in the suit. And that's you. You came to dinner. Richard stared at the drawing for a long time. Something inside him cracked open. He had spent his career building walls between himself and the people affected by his decisions. Numbers and projections had always protected him from names and faces. But here in a child's drawing he saw himself not as a distant executive, but as family. "Do you want me to keep this?" he asked carefully. "Yes," Sophie said, "because if you keep it, then you have to come back. Otherwise, it won't be true." He folded the paper with care and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Then I'll come back," he promised. The bell rang again, and Sophie packed up her new lunchbox, holding it tightly as if it were treasure. Richard walked her to the classroom door. Other parents waited in the hall, greeting their children, but Sophie walked alone. She turned once more to him before disappearing into her class. "Don't forget," she said firmly. Richard left the school with the drawing pressed against his heart. He had entered this place, planning to give a small gift. Instead, he had walked out carrying a responsibility he could not ignore. The echo of her words. "That's you." You came to dinner followed him all the way back to his car. As the driver opened the door, Richard hesitated. For the first time in years, his next move had nothing to do with profit or status. It had everything to do with a little girl who believed that tomorrow could be better and who had trusted him to be part of it. Richard Cole had never walked through the narrow streets of Florence with a sense of fear before. He had visited the city for board meetings, for dinners in fancy halls, for photo opportunities that painted him as a man of vision, but this time was different. This time he wasn't stepping into a villa or a hotel suite. He was following a 7-year-old girl to a small apartment above a closed bakery. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp stone and old bread. Sophie climbed quickly, her sunflower lunchbox bouncing at her side. Richard followed more slowly, his shiny shoes echoing in the narrow corridor. She stopped at a door with peeling paint and pressed her R against it before turning the handle. "Mama," she called softly, "I'm home." The apartment was barely larger than one of Richard's guest bathrooms. A small bed stood in the corner, a thin blanket folded carefully across it. A hot plate sat on a counter beside a cracked sink. The light came from one window, its curtain faded and patched. On the table lay a stack of unopened envelopes, their red lettering visible even from where he stood overdue. Bills, warnings, final notices. Sophie set her lunchbox down and hurried to the figure lying on the bed. Isabella Martinez was not old mid-30s, Richard guessed, but illness and exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes. She turned her head slowly, revealing sharp cheekbones and lips pressed tight with determination. Even in her weakness, there was a kind of strength that commanded respect. "This is Mr. Cole," Sophie announced proudly as though introducing royalty. "He's the one who brought me the new lunchbox." Isabella pushed herself up against the pillow, her movements careful, betraying fatigue. She tried to hide. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, her accent soft but clear, "I don't know what to say. My daughter doesn't usually bring home strangers." Richard tilted his head, unsure of how to respond. He felt like an intruder in this room where every corner spoke of survival. "Your daughter is extraordinary," he said at last. She has a way of making the world brighter." Isabella's lips curved into a faint smile. "She is carried more than a child should, but she keeps us both standing." Her eyes shifted to Sophie, who was unpacking her drawing supplies onto the floor as if nothing in the world was wrong. Richard hesitated before speaking again. "Sophie told me you worked in Florence at the textile factory." For the shortest moment, something flickered across Isabella's face. Pain, pride, maybe both. "Yes," she said simply. "I worked there for 11 years. My mother worked there before me. We thought it was safe, but then the orders slowed. The manager said costs were too high. And one day, they gathered us in the break room. They read names off a list. Mine was one of them." Her words were steady, but Richard heard the weight beneath them. He knew that list. He had signed the order himself. He remembered the meeting in Rome, the advisors urging cuts, the charts that made it look like the only smart choice. To him, it had been numbers on a spreadsheet. To her, it had been the destruction of a life. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though the words felt sadly small. Isabella gave a short laugh, not mean, but resigned. "Sorry doesn't pay rent, Mr. Cole. Sorry doesn't keep the lights on. But I am not asking for pity. I found other work when I could, cleaning offices at night, mending clothes for neighbors. It was never enough, but it was something. When I became sick, well, Sophie learned to do more for herself. That's the hardest part, watching your child carry burdens she should never know." Richard felt the air grow heavy. His eyes fell on the lunchbox. Sophie had set carefully on the table, the bright sunflowers glowing against the dim room. It looked almost out of place in such surroundings, like a burst of hope in the middle of defeat. He realized then that the small gift he had brought meant far more than he had intended. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he asked, his voice low. Isabella straightened slightly. "Because help always comes with strings. Because people look at you differently once they know you cannot stand on your own. I wanted Sophie to believe her mother was strong, not broken." Richard swallowed hard. He thought of the fancy dinners he had hosted, the charities he had supported, with checks signed over fine wine. He had told himself he was doing good. Yet here, in this simple apartment, he saw the faces behind the statistics he had treated as numbers. He saw the cost of efficiency written in the hollow of Isabella's cheeks and the quies et courage of her child. Sophie interrupted the silence by rushing over with a new drawing. This time she had sketched a small house with 3 figures standing outside. "That's Mama. That's me. And that's you," she explained. "See, we're all together." Isabella looked at the paper and then at Richard, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've only known her for 2 days, and already she's drawing you into our lives. Children don't see the world the way adults do. They believe what they feel, not what they calculate." Richard met her gaze without looking away. "Maybe that's what we've forgotten. Maybe children are right more often than we admit." For a long moment neither spoke. The weight of unasked questions hung in the room. Richard wanted to tell her the truth, that he was not just a visitor, not just a wealthy man who had stumbled into their world by chance. He wanted to confess that the decision that had ended her job carried his name at the bottom of the page, but the words stuck in his throat. If he told her now, would it break the fragile trust that was forming? He looked again at Sophie, who was humming softly as she colored the roof of the little house. The innocence in her movements only deepened his decision. He could not undo the past, but he could choose what came next. "I don't want to be another stranger who disappears," he said finally. "I want to help, not as charity, but as a promise. Your daughter deserves more than empty promises." Isabella studied him carefully, weighing his words. Pride battled with need in her expression. At last she nodded, though her voice remained firm. "Help her first. If you can do that, then we will see." That night, as Richard left the small apartment, the air of Florence felt different. The city's beauty had always been in its grand churches, its museums, its wealth of history. But now, for him, its meaning was tied to a worn-out apartment above a bakery, to a mother fighting to stand, and to a little girl who believed a sunflow, where Lunchbox could hold a feast. He walked back into the night carrying Sophie's drawing folded neatly in his pocket, and the heavy knowledge that the cost of his decisions had a name, a face, and a family he could no longer ignore. The following week, Richard Cole stepped into the marble lobby of his company's headquarters in Rome with a weight in his chest he could no longer ignore. His board of directors was waiting upstairs, eager to discuss quarterly earnings and new acquisitions, but Richard had only one thing on his mind: Isabella Martinez and her daughter Sophie, the small apartment in Florence, the stack of unpaid bills, the look in Isabella's eyes when she spoke of her lost job. They had become more real to him than the balance sheet spread across his desk. The boardroom was bright and polished, a long glass table surrounded by men and women in custom suits. They rose when he entered, then settled quickly as the meeting began. For years, Richard had led these sessions with precision, every word measured for efficiency. But today his voice carried something different. "We need to revisit the layoffs in Florence," he began without introduction, particularly those that took place at the textile division. A murmur swept across the room. One director leaned forward, his tone sharp. "That decision saved us millions. The factory was underperforming. We can't afford to reverse it." Richard's eyes were steady. "It may have saved money, but it destroyed lives. People who gave years of service were dismissed like numbers on a chart." "I signed that order, and I plan to correct it." Another director shook his head. "Richard, this isn't personal. It was business. If we start reopening every decision because of feeling, we lose credibility with investors." The old Richard might have agreed, but the image of Sophie's drawing burned in his pocket like a brand. He leaned forward, his Voice firm. This is personal. That's exactly the problem. We've made it impersonal for too long. We hide behind numbers and forget they represent families, children, futures. If we have credibility issues, they come from forgetting our humanity. The room fell silent. No one dared to challenge him directly, but the unease was clear. Richard knew he was pushing against a culture he had built himself, a culture of ruthless efficiency. Still, he pressed on. I want Isabella Martinez reinstated immediately with fair compensation for what she lost, and I want a review of every layoff in Florence. We'll prioritize rehiring where possible. The directors exchanged worried glances. One finally spoke. You're asking us to rewrite history. Investors will ask why. What do we tell them? Richard answered without pause. Tell them we are investing in people. Tell them that we refuse to profit at the expense of dignity. If they can't understand that, then maybe they're not the investors we need. The words surprised even him, but once spoken, he felt their truth resonate. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stock prices or quarterly reports. He was thinking about Sophie opening her lunchbox and finding nothing inside. The board pushed back for hours, arguing risks and warning of shareholder revolts. Richard listened, but his decision never wavered. By the end of the meeting, the first steps were in motion. Isabella would be offered a new position in Florence, one that matched her skills and recognized her loyalty. And more importantly, Richard had planted the seed of change within the company itself. That night, he drove to Florence personally to deliver the news. Isabella opened the door, her expression cautious. Sophie ran forward, sunflower lunchbox, swinging her face lighting up when she saw him. You came back, she said, as if she had never doubted it. Richard crouched to meet her eyes. I promised, didn't I? Then he turned to Isabella. I've spoken with the board. You have your job back, but not just that. We're creating new policies to ensure what happened to you doesn't happen again. Isabella's face tightened. Why would you do this out of guilt, charity? Richard shook his head. Out of responsibility, out of respect. You deserved better and I failed you. This isn't about pity, it's about making things right. For a moment she said nothing, studying him with tired eyes. Then she nodded slowly, though pride still lingered in her voice. I don't want favors. I want to earn it. You already did, Richard said softly. Now it's time we honor that. In the weeks that followed, Richard went further. He launched a program called Lunch for Every Child, ensuring that every student in Florence's public schools received a free meal each day. What had started with a single lunchbox became a citywide initiative, and soon other regions were watching. Newspapers wrote about the billionaire who had changed course, about the man who had once been known for ruthless efficiency, but was now speaking openly about responsibility and care. At the school cafeteria, Sophie no longer sat alone, pretending to serve invisible food. She became the first child to help distribute the new meals, proudly handing plates to her classmates. Richard visited often, not as a benefactor, making a show of generosity, but as a man learning how to show up. One afternoon, she brought him a new drawing. This time, the table was longer, crowded with children eating together. She had drawn herself at the head, her mother beside her, and Richard at the other end, smiling. Now everyone gets to eat, she explained. Richard felt something stir in his chest that no business victory had ever given him. It wasn't pride, it was belonging. The board continued to grumble, investors continued to question, but Richard no longer cared in the same way. He had seen what real wealth looked like, not in ledgers, but in the sparkle of a child's eyes when she knew tomorrow would bring food, not an apology note. One evening, as he walked out of the Florence factory after a long day, workers stopped to shake his hand. Some looked skeptical, others grateful, but all recognized that something had shifted. He wasn't hiding behind glass walls anymore. He was here among them, carrying the same air of responsibility they had carried all along. And when he returned to the small apartment above the bakery, Isabella met him at the door with quiet strength. You've changed more than my life, she said simply. You've changed my daughter's future. Richard nodded, humbled. She changed mine first. It was the truth he carried with him everywhere now. Not the numbers, not the headlines, but the memory of an empty lunchbox and the promise he had made to fill it, not just for one child, but for many. Spring came slowly to Florence. carrying with it a sense of renewal that Richard Cole had never experienced before. For years, his calendar had been marked by earnings calls, business trips, and quarterly reviews. Now his days were measured by smaller moments, the sound of Sophie's laughter in the schoolyard, Isabella's voice growing stronger with each passing week, the ordinary rhythm of a life that was no longer about control, but about presence. Isabella had accepted her new position at the factory, this time not behind a sewing machine, but in a managerial role. Richard had insisted on it, not as a gift, but as recognition of the loyalty and skill she had already proven. At first, she resisted, suspicious that it was charity wrapped in formality, but over time she realized he meant what he said. She had earned it long before he ever stepped into her life. Each morning she walked to work with her head held higher, her step steadier, her voice carrying more authority. The same workers who had once seen her as another victim of the layoffs now looked to her as someone who had come back stronger. Sophie thrived in her own world. No longer hiding in the corner of the cafeteria, she had become the unofficial hostess of the new meal program, greeting classmates and teachers as if the whole initiative had been her personal idea. She carried her sunflower lunchbox proudly, though it was now filled with real food each day. Sometimes she still played her restaurant game, but this time she had real plates to serve, and she shared them with joy. Her teachers noted her confidence, her eagerness to learn, and her way of drawing others into her circle. She was no longer the quiet child pretending. She was leading, and she was blooming. Richard found himself drawn deeper into their lives in ways he hadn't planned. He stopped thinking of visits as duties and began seeing them as anchors. Dinners at Isabella's small kitchen table became the highlight of his week. Sometimes the meals were simple soup bread, fresh vegetables from a nearby market, but they carried a warmth he had never known in the dining rooms of his estates. Sophie told stories with wild hand gestures. Isabella listened with amused patience, and Richard discovered the quiet beauty of just being present. One evening, Sophie handed him another drawing. This one showed a home with 3 windows and a garden out front. Inside the house were 3 figures, a woman, a girl, and a man in a suit without a briefcase. She had drawn them holding hands. "That's us," she explained plainly. "It's our house when we're all together." Richard stared at the drawing longer than he meant to, his throat tightening. It was not the kind of future he had ever imagined for himself, but in the bright colors of a child's imagination, he saw a truth he could no longer deny. They already felt like family. Isabella noticed the look in his eyes and spoke carefully. "You've done more than anyone could have expected. You've given Sophie hope again. You've given me back my dignity, but you don't owe us more than that." Richard shook his head. "It isn't about owing, it's about wanting to stay. About choosing to stay." She looked at him quietly, as though weighing whether she could believe him. For years, she had carried the burden of survival alone, trusting no one but herself. Allowing someone else into that circle was not easy, but the way Sophie clung to him, the way her eyes lit up when he arrived, had already written him into their story. As the weeks turned into months, the 3 of them built a rhythm. Richard learned to shop for groceries, to sit through Sophie's school presentations, to walk with Isabella through the city streets without bodyguards or press. He discovered he could find joy in the most ordinary acts, helping Sophie with homework, carrying laundry up the apartment stairs, listening to Isabella talk about her ideas for improving conditions at the factory. For the first time in his life, his identity was not measured by titles or bank accounts, but by how fully he showed up. One afternoon, as spring sunlight poured through the window, Sophie slipped a folded note into her lunchbox. At dinner, she handed it to Richard with a shy grin. He opened it and read, "Thank you for showing up. You're part of our family now." His eyes blurred before he could finish the words. He had cried before standing in a cafeteria over a little girl's empty lunchbox, but this time the tears came from fullness. He reached for her hand, and then for Isabella's. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Isabella's voice was firm. "You don't have to deserve it. You just have to keep choosing it." Richard nodded, overwhelmed by the simplicity of it. For so long he had believed that life was about earning, proving, conquering. But here, with a child's note and a woman's steady gaze, he understood that love was not about deserving. It was about staying. The story of Richard Cole, once a billionaire known only for ruthless efficiency, spread beyond Florence. Reporters wrote about a man who had launched a program to feed school children, who had reinstated laid-off workers, who was changing the culture of his company from the inside out. But for Richard, the real story was not in the headlines. It was in a small apartment above a bakery, in a sunflower lunchbox that no longer carried shame in the fragile but growing bond of a family that had made room for him. He no longer felt the emptiness that had haunted him in glass towers and luxury cars. He felt something far greater and unshakable belonging, and as he tucked Sophie into bed that night, her note still in his pocket, he realized the truth he had been chasing all along. Real wealth was not measured in numbers, but in presence, love, and the courage to choose people over power. When Sophie whispered sleepily, "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" he smiled, brushing her hair from her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and for the first time, he knew it was true. Richard Cole's journey began with a chance encounter in a simple school cafeteria in Florence. But what unfolded after that moment was far greater than even he could have imagined. A billionaire known for ruthless efficiency and a cold mastery of numbers, Richard never expected that a worn lunchbox carried by a hungry little girl named Sophie would break the walls he had built around himself. The note inside, written by her exhausted mother, Isabella, apologizing for having no food to give, cut through him more sharply than any boardroom defeat. That moment was more than just emotional. It was transformative. From that day forward, Richard's life took a path that defied everything he thought he valued. He returned to the school not out of obligation, but because Sophie's smile and courage awakened something he thought he had lost: his humanity. What started as a simple gesture of providing food grew into a bond with Sophie and Isabella, a bond rooted not in wealth but in sincerity. Richard realized that true wealth was not in empires or estates, but in the trust of a child who invited him into her imaginary restaurant and offered him a seat at her table of nothing. When Isabella's truth came out, her years of loyalty as a worker cast aside without care, her struggle to survive after being discarded by the very system Richard helped build, he was confronted with the deepest contradiction of his life. He had been the architect of numbers, yet blind to the people those numbers destroyed. The moment he owned that truth was the moment redemption became possible. Richard didn't run from responsibility. He faced it head on. He chose not just to restore Isabella's dignity with a fair job, but to shift the very culture of his company, proving that business can and should serve humanity. And from there, something even greater grew, a program that provided meals to children who might otherwise go hungry. A community uplifted not by charity, but by a recognition that dignity begins with the basics: food, work, and hope. Sophie, the little girl with the empty lunchbox, became the spark of a movement that extended far beyond her schoolyard. Richard, once a man who measured success only in profits, discovered a legacy: far more valuable lives changed for the better. Because he had finally seen the faces behind the numbers. What does this story leave us with? A lesson that cuts deeper than sentiment. Life will always present us with numbers, deadlines, and responsibilities. But behind each number is a person, a story, a heartbeat. It is easy to look away to justify choices in the name of efficiency or ambition. But the truth is, real strength comes from facing the consequences of our decisions and daring to do better. Richard's story is not about a billionaire saving a little girl. It is about a man learning that power without compassion is empty, and that the smallest act of kindness can ripple into something world-changing. For us in our everyday lives, the lesson is clear. We may not all command corporations or sit in penthouses, but each of us holds the power to see the unseen, to notice the struggles of the people around us, and to act. Whether it's offering a meal, lending a listening ear, or standing up for fairness where others turn away, these choices build a legacy of care and connection. Compassion is not weakness. It is the most enduring strength we can bring to the world. If Richard could be transformed by an empty lunchbox, perhaps we too can be moved by the silent needs right in front of us. Maybe today, there is someone in your life who needs you to notice, to act, to care. Thank you for staying with this story. If it touched you, if it made you pause and reflect on what really matters, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating stories that inspire challenge and remind us all of the power we hold to make a difference. Together, we can share more than just stories. We can share change.